into history. ASMR.
So with that, I'm going to talk about Hernando Cortes and some of his background. Cortes was trained in law, not as a soldier, like many of the conquistadors. He was born in Spain to a family of lesser nobility. He seeked his fortune over here in Hispaniola and later in Cuba. In Cuba, he served as a magistrate. While in that role, he started working with the governor of Cuba by the name of Diego Velázquez on planning an expedition to Mexico. The whole purpose of the journey and the expedition was to seek gold. Diego Velázquez wanted to be the primary funder of the expedition, but there was a problem. Suddenly, Velázquez started noticing Cortes over here in Havana was speeding up his prep for the expedition. So Velázquez got a little suspicious, and he began to think that Cortes had his own agenda and that he was out to get all the glory for himself. So Velázquez sent an order to Havana to have Cortes removed from command. But Cortes completely ordered that order, and then his ships left Cuba in 1519, and he had about 11 ships. So those 11 ships were sailing towards Mexico, and you can ignore these lines here because these lines are from another expedition. This was a good map for me to use. So the ships were leaving Havana, and they got caught in a storm and ended up down here around Cozumel. And you're probably very familiar with Cozumel, as it is a popular tourist destination now. So as Cortes and his men are in Cozumel, Cortes started working with his army, trying to get them to work together as a unit. He also started trying to communicate with the native tribes there. So his army left Cozumel after a brief period of time, and they sailed around the Yucatan Peninsula here. They landed down here in a little town, not on the map, but it's about right here. It was a native town called Potocan. And then after that, he began to understand that the natives had overwhelming numbers of population and his men would be overwhelmed. So Cortes started utilizing his diplomacy and summoned many of the chiefs from the local tribes in this area. He showed the chiefs a demonstration of his firepower and cannons. He gave them the option to either become vassals of the Spanish crown or to die. The chiefs immediately brought them gifts of gold and fine cloth. The gold started piquing Cortes's interest, wondering, where did that come from? So the natives had indicated that it was in a land over here called Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital. Cortes then determined that he would stop at nothing to conquer Tenochtitlan and get more gold. So I'm going to switch to the other map, which gives a little bit more of a detailed look at the journey and the events of the Cortes expedition. So down here, the men are they've landed right here in San Juan del, I think Ulia is what it was called. This is actually modern day Veracruz, and eventually they establish a colony here and they call it Veracruz. Around this time in this area, the Spaniards started using a female native interpreter to help them communicate with the natives. A girl in her late teens by the name of Malinali became the interpreter that was closest to Cortes, and he was rarely without her. She also became his mistress, and bore him a son. So the fleet then, once they're here in Veracruz, there was an under chief in the area by the name of Tuatili. Cortes expressed his desire to that chief that he wanted to meet Montezuma. Tuatili said this was impossible, but he gave Cortes gifts of gold in hopes that that would placate him. Instead, it made Cortes thirst for more, and he would stop at nothing to get it. Around this time, some of Cortes's men wanted to return to Cuba to Diego Velázquez with some of the gold, but Cortes dismissed this because he knew if he returned to Cuba, he would be treated as a traitor for sailing to Mexico without authorization. So instead, Cortes decided to resign his previous commission and petition the king to allow him to designate Veracruz down here as a colony, with Cortes as governor, of course. Of course, sending a delegation to the king with the gold that they had acquired. He did so, and then the local tribe in this area, known as the Totonacs, started talking to Cortes. The Totonacs were tired of being subject to the Aztecs. Cortes played this to his advantage when the Aztec tax collectors arrived in this area. And this is in the area of Ciempoala. Cortes was able to convince the Totonacs to arrest the Aztec tax collectors. Cortes then left some of the Aztec tax collectors escape. He wanted to be sure that they told Montezuma what was happening. Even more bold, Cortes had the Totonac idol statues destroyed, essentially purging the Totonacs of their religion. This put them between a rock and a hard place, because since the Aztecs had known that they had rebelled, they had to side with Cortes. There was still the matter of dealing with the faction of Spaniards who supported the Cuban governor Velázquez. Cortes hanged the leader of the faction and then seized the ship in order to prevent anyone else from returning to Cuba. Cortes began at this point marching into the interior of Mexico with the ultimate goal of getting over here to Tenochtitlan. Cortes had also heard from the local tribes about an area over here called Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was a loose confederation of tribes located between the coastal plains. When I say the coastal plains, I mean these coastal plains here and between there and Lake Texcoco. So for the Tlaxcalans' part, Cortes knew that since they were an enemy of Montezuma, he could perhaps use this to his advantage. On one hand, he was advised that befriending the Tlaxcalans could immediately make him an enemy of the Aztecs. The Totonacs advised Cortes that they would be a useful ally, so Cortes decided to fill out the situation by sending 6 cavalrymen ahead over here to Tlaxcala as scouts. The Tlaxcalans had 15 warriors that immediately attacked the scouts with spears and killed 2 horses and wounded 3 men. Then about 5,000 Tlaxcalan warriors showed up. The cavalry did some damage to those warriors. Then when the Spanish infantry arrived, the Tlaxcalans withdrew and then attacked again with stronger numbers the following morning. Cortes led a raid that burned the Tlaxcalan villages and kept several villagers as prisoners. This kind of total war was effective, and it was something that Cortes would end up repeating over and over again. Ultimately, the Tlaxcalans surrendered, and they forged peace with Cortes by claiming that they only attacked the Spaniards because they assumed that the Spaniards were allied with Montezuma. Montezuma, in the past, tolerated the existence of Tlaxcala because the Aztec warriors liked to use Tlaxcala as a lesser enemy to prepare its warriors to fight stronger foes. Having this knowledge became a turning point for Cortes because he now knew that Tlaxcala would help him in his attempt to conquer the Aztecs. So Cortes remained right here in Tlaxcala for 20 days to allow his men to rest and to better forge his alliance with the natives. After being there, Cortes decided to go to Cholula. Cholula right here was a very populous, wealthy city. They were allied with the Aztecs. Cortes wanted to use that trip as an opportunity to sort of feel Montezuma out, to see if he would receive him. The Tlaxcalans advised him against this plan, as they thought Cortes was walking into a trap down here at Cholula. But Cortes decided by overruling that concern, he could make himself appear strong. The Tlaxcalans sent 100,000 well-armed warriors alongside Cortes, but as they neared Cholula, Cortes ended up sending most of the warriors back to Tlaxcala, as he didn't want to alarm the Aztecs. In Cholula, the Spaniards were received with kindness at first. Cortes remained on his guard, however, because he had observed an undercurrent of an attitude with the Cholulans here. The Cholulans had been feeding the Spanish for 3 days, and then abruptly they stopped. The Cholulans began to taunt the Spanish, and Malinali, who was the native mistress of Cortes, found out from talking to some of the native women that a massacre was being prepared in Cholula. Cortes summoned the Cholulans and observed the natives heavily armored. He secretly told his men and his new Totonac allies to be prepared to descend upon the Cholulans at the first fire of a musket. They did so, and then the Spaniards set their temple ablaze. 3,000 natives in Cholula were killed on October 18th in 2 hours of fighting. Then Cortes summoned the Tlaxcalans and allowed them to slaughter the Cholulans, and then the Tlaxcalans pillaged and plundered the town of Cholula. Montezuma, for his part, was shocked at the news of the defeat of the Cholulans. Some of Montezuma's allies worked behind the scenes with the native tribes that were over here near Cholula to attempt to convince Cortes of an easy way to the Aztec capital, with the idea that they could ambush the Spaniards. Cortes read the situation and sent scouts out to check out this so-called shortcut. The men returned with the news that the shortcut was impassable for Cortes and his men. But more importantly, the men told Cortes of large cities and towns over here in this humongous lake, with a large city, Tenochtitlan, right here in the middle of it. Cortes worked on forming alliances with some of the surrounding tribes, knowing that he would need them for his impending war with the Aztecs. Many of Montezuma's allies made attempts at controlling these smaller tribes, and all these attempts would end up coming back to haunt Montezuma. The Spaniards started marching towards Lake Texcoco, and they were met by a distant cousin of Montezuma named Cacama, king of Texcoco. He advised that he would be helping the Spaniards on the rest of their journey up here to the Aztec capital. The men then marched out here to Itzapalpa on the shores of Lake Texcoco. One of the Spaniards later described the scene. We went ahead on the causeway, which is 8 paces wide and goes directly to the Aztec capital. The whole causeway was so full of natives that there was barely any room anywhere. Natives came in from canoes from every part of the lake. They had never seen horses nor men like us. We didn't know what to say because we could hardly believe what we were seeing. On the land there were great cities, and on the lake there were more. We saw the whole lake was filled with canoes. Before us was the great city of Mexico. We remembered the words told to us by our native allies that we should beware of entering Tenochtitlan because they would kill us once we were inside. So once they arrived here in Tenochtitlan, a carpet was rolled out for Montezuma. Cortes wanted to embrace Montezuma, but the princes told him that that was impossible. So instead, Cortes took a necklace off and put it around Montezuma's neck. Montezuma then returned the favor by placing a necklace of small shells around the neck of Cortes. Montezuma had a discussion with Cortes where he explained Aztec history and about a legend of a mighty chief that brought the Aztecs into power. The legend had it that one day the descendants of the chief would return. He told Cortes that it appeared that the prophecy had been fulfilled and that the land was now Cortes's to command as he pleased. In a later conversation in an Aztec temple, Cortes told Montezuma that it was a curiosity that it seemed that the Aztec worshipped demons and not the one true God. Montezuma became insulted by this and stated that he regretted bringing the Spaniards there. Cortes began to become very suspicious of Montezuma and the Aztecs from that point on. He started discussions with his Tlaxcalan allies. They warned Cortes that the entire city over here in Tenochtitlan was a trap. They said that Montezuma could raise the bridges to the city and to send warriors on them to destroy them. Cortes decided to strike first. He summoned Montezuma and placed him under arrest. He did so without the knowledge of the general populace of the city even realizing it. Cortes essentially was running Tenochtitlan with Montezuma as his puppet. He allowed the usual functions of Aztec government to continue, but with his mistress Malinali listening with a very intent ear. But Cortes made one critical error. He sent his men to the temple and had the idols smashed. Cortes told the priests that their idols would be replaced by a statue of the Virgin Mary. The priests told Cortes that this was a mistake because the Aztecs were willing to die for their gods. Cortes already noticed the Aztecs were mobilizing to rebel against Cortes. Montezuma heard this and demanded to be taken to the temple to speak to Cortes. Montezuma requested that Cortes leave the idols undisturbed, but put a cross next to the idols. Cortes agreed, but also demanded that the blood sacrifices of the Aztecs cease, and the temple be cleansed and whitewashed. This was more than the Aztecs could bear, so the Aztecs mobilized and prepared to destroy the Spaniards. Montezuma, knowing this was happening, saw an opportunity and sent word to his generals. Cortes's mistress caught wind of this. Cortes now realized he could not win diplomatically. He sent word over here to Villarica to prepare to dispatch ships to the Caribbean for reinforcements. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Governor Velázquez sent Panfilo de Narvaez to Mexico to arrest Cortes for deliberately disobeying his order and leading the illegal expedition. Cortes learned of this, and he dispatched envoys to meet Narvaez and his men over here at Simpola on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. The envoys were sent with gifts of gold and fine cloth and stories of the grandeur of the Aztec Empire. Narvaez's men became somewhat mutinous upon seeing and hearing these stories of grandeur. Some of them immediately jumped to Cortes's side, leaving Narvaez and some of the loyalists fighting the battle against Cortes and his men over here at Simpoala. Narvaez used a temple there to fortify himself, but Cortes had his men set the temple on fire, leading Narvaez's men to surrender. Narvaez lost an eye in the battle and was arrested. Cortes pardoned most of Narvaez's men and incorporated them into his own army. While in Simpoala, one of Narvaez's men had developed smallpox, and it infected the household that he was quartered in. The disease spread like wildfire among the natives at Simpoala, but most of the Spaniards carried an immunity to it. It would hasten the conquest of the Aztecs as it spread throughout their population. Meanwhile, back over here in the Aztecs' capital, one of Cortez's lieutenants left in charge by the name of Alvarado was dealing with an uprising. The Aztecs were angry at the Christian cross being in their temple. He managed to catch wind of most of this and arrested several priests. He had his men ready for the native attack. Alvarado and his Tlaxcalan allies attacked the priests and the noblemen, leaving the Aztecs in a state of confusion. By now, Cortes had come back from Simpoala. Cortes quickly had his men fortify all of these towers at Tenochtitlan. Hordes of Aztec warriors rushed the palace. As the warriors began to overwhelm Cortes, Cortes had the temple burned and started burning all the surrounding buildings. But based on sheer numbers, the Spanish didn't stand a chance. It was around this time that Montezuma died. There is some conjecture as to how he died. Some sources say that Cortez's men did it. Another story is that some of his own people did, out of anger for him allowing the Spaniards to come to the city to begin with. Most Spanish sources place the blame on the Aztec people, but most Aztec sources say that Cortes ordered the execution. Cortez's captains advised him that remaining over here in the Aztec capital was dangerous, and this would be his downfall. They advised him they could either leave them in retreat or stay behind. At midnight that very night, Cortes began a daring retreat, but not before purging the capital of 8 tons of gold. As they retreated out of the city with the gold, many of the Aztecs tried to destroy them. The bulk of Cortez's army, about 600, died. The native Tlaxcalan allies of Cortes lost several thousand. The night of the retreat out of Tenochtitlan became known as the Noche Triste, or Sad Night. As the Spaniards started marching over here towards Tlaxcala, the Aztecs pursued them to the plain of Otumba, which is located about right here, hoping to completely finish them off. Cortes tried to build up his men for one last stand. He implored them to fight for their country and king. As the fighting intensified, Cortes later recounted, "We could hardly distinguish between ourselves and them, fighting so fiercely. Certainly we believed it was our last day, for the Indians were very strong and we could resist them, but feebly as we were exhausted, and nearly all of us were wounded and weak from hunger." But as things were getting at their most untenable, Cortes spotted the group of warlords directing the battle for the Aztecs. Cortes lined up his horsemen and led a mounted charge towards the warlords. The senior chief was impaled on a lance, destroying the morale of the Aztecs, causing them to retreat back. The Spaniards, for their part, were able to come back over here to Tlaxcala, and their army was spared. Cortes then took the opportunity to nurse his army's wounds, await reinforcements, and get ready for the next steps. He received his reinforcements and additional powder that came over from Cuba, and those reinforcements were actually initially intended for Narvaez. He also received the benefit of the gold that he'd sent back to the king, as now reinforcements from Spain also arrived. So while he had all this going for him, over here in Tenochtitlan, smallpox began to take out a huge chunk of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were now led by a new emperor named Cuitlahuac. Back in the Aztec capital, the natives began to be surrounded by the Spanish and Tlaxcalan alliance. They held the city under siege and would keep attacking the city. relentlessly. Whenever the Spaniards would attack and get captured, the Aztecs would immediately destroy the Spaniards and throw the limbs of the dead Spaniards at the enemy. This was very demoralizing to the Spaniards, but it only intensified Cortes's resolve and made him want to fight more viciously. As blocks of the Aztecs' capital were secured, Cortes had the buildings destroyed and used them to fill in parts of the lake to make it easier for more soldiers and horses to cross over to Tenochtitlan. But since Cortes had blocked out all relief to the city, and since the Aztecs were dying in great numbers due to smallpox, eventually the Spaniards and their allies took control of the capital. So as Cortes began to subjugate the Aztecs, he decided to rebuild the Aztec capital. This eventually became modern-day Mexico City. There's many more to the story of the creation of the Mexican nation, but this is how it began. Cortes, for his part, had very harsh tactics, but he was downright bold in his conquest. History has rightly judged him harshly. I appreciate your attention as I presented this story, which is both tragic and triumphant. It is a story that was needed to be told. I hope you will check out my other videos on Hernando De Soto and Cabeza de Vaca, two other conquistadors. Thank you for your attention. Good night.
And talk about the Narvaez expedition and the story of Cabeza de Vaca as well. So in Spain, Panfilo Narvaez, who was a veteran in the conquest of Cuba here, in 1528, he was recruited by the King of Spain to explore and conquer parts of northern Mexico over here. And later he was planning to establish colonies in all of those places along the Gulf of Mexico. But his ships sailed out of Seville and made several stops, including Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, Santiago on the island of Cuba, Trinidad also on the island of Cuba, and finally Havana, where they decided to sail to Mexico from. And it should have been a fairly easy trip from Havana to Mexico, and it would not have really been too bad, except that the captain who was in charge, the captain of the ship, made a terrible mistake and completely miscalculated their route to Mexico. He actually missed that calculation by more than 900 miles because he did not account for the intense Gulf Stream. They were pushed north towards Florida. So they ended up on the west coast on April 12th of 1528 near modern-day Tampa Bay. So as they land right here in Tampa Bay, they found a poor landscape with swamps and hostile natives. And this is where our story picks up on this map. It's a very interesting map because it actually shows the tribes and actually shows La Florida, as they called it, as it was at the time. So as they're in Tampa Bay, Narvaez decided that he would get all of his horsemen and his able-bodied soldiers to march on land towards the north on an overland route. And then the sailors and captives would sail north and they would rendezvous up here in Appalachia, because they had heard from some of the natives of these Tocobaga tribe here near Tampa Bay. They had heard that there was gold. So they continued heading north as the ships headed north as well, with the hopes of rendezvousing. So as they're trudging through Florida, through this land the Spaniards had many challenges getting food. As they crossed this river right here, which is called the Withlacoochee River, it's still there today. It's south of modern-day Ocala, near Bushnell, Florida. The natives of that area took the Spaniards as a threat, immediately attacking them. But the Spaniards did manage to get the upper hand. The positive that came out of it for Narvaez's men was that the natives that they just dominated had plenty of maize. So the Spanish were able to procure that maize from them, and it likely saved the Spaniards from starvation. But the negative that came out of that was that there became a growing rift between Narvaez and his men. They were scared, since they were in this land route that they were taking. They were afraid that they would never be able to meet up with the ships. This actually ended up turning out to be very justifiable fear. So they did ask Narvaez if they would allow them to send some scouts to the coast down here so that they could ensure that they were close by where the ships were. Narvaez, for his part, was like, I just want to get up here to Appalachia. I don't really care. We'll find them again. I'm not worried. Because in his mind, they were in Mexico, and the ships would end up running into him eventually. Well, finally, as they kept going and they didn't spot any ships, he finally did send a contingent of men, which included his treasurer Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, to try to find the ships. So they weren't successful finding these ships at all. So Narvaez said, okay, we're going to just get to Appalachia. We can at least get some gold and get something good out of this expedition. So as they were continuing in that direction, they encountered the Ustaga tribe up here. The Ustaga lived near modern-day Lake City, Florida, which is just north of Gainesville. And as it turned out, the Ustaga were actually enemies of the Appalachia. So the Ustaga were very eager to point Narvaez and his men towards the Appalachia, hoping that eventually they would be able to gain an upper hand against them. So as Narvaez and his men started entering the outskirts of the Appalachia territory, Cabeza de Vaca and the others were feeling very relieved. As Cabeza de Vaca later wrote, on finding ourselves where we desired to be, and where they told us there was so much food and so much gold, it had seemed to us that a great portion of our hardship and weariness had been lifted from us. At this point, it had been a full year since their expedition had originally departed from Spain. So as they're in Appalachia territory, they entered a village, and in that village there was very few men. The village had mostly women and children. So the Spaniards took the women and children and insisted that they would only release them if the chief would be traded as a hostage. They were successful in getting that trade for the chief, but the outcome did not work out very well for the Spaniards. The natives resorted to guerrilla tactics. So as they're in this village, they stayed there for 25 days. They were able to feed off of corn that had been captured from the natives, but there was absolutely no gold to speak of. So then Narvaez decided, okay, we're going to need to save ourselves rather than continuing to search for gold. So they heard about a village down in this area near modern day Apalachicola. The village was called Aute, spelled A-U-T-E. They were hoping that they could resupply there, and they still had an outside chance or a thought of possibly rendezvousing with their ships. but the ships unfortunately were still unaccounted for. The trip to Ayut was filled with many problems. The Spaniards ended up in nearly impassable swamps. The swamps were chest deep, and the men were also ambushed by natives. After 9 days, the Spanish reached Ayut, but the village had actually been purposely burned to the ground. The natives were perfectly aware of what the Spaniards were up to. In addition, 40 of Narvaez's men came down with typhoid. The expedition lost many. So at this point, their numbers were dwindled down to about 250, and they were heading closer to the Gulf of Mexico, hoping to find the ships. They found the bay there to be very shallow, which concerned everyone greatly because they were thinking the ships would never get there. So the men became further discouraged. So I'm going to take this point to go right back to the original map that we looked at. So here we are in September 1528 in Appalachia Bay. And I want to take a brief moment to talk about what happened to the ships. So the ships that were supposed to rendezvous with Narvaez had their own problems. As they were searching for Narvaez, Narvaez had ordered the ships to sail to Mexico to wait for the overland party. But Narvaez was totally unaware that they were thousands of miles away from Mexico at the time. And the sailors eventually figured it out, that they were nowhere near Mexico. And they realized the chances of them running into Narvaez were slim to none. So one of the ships came back to Cuba to get additional supplies, and it did so and rejoined the other ships up in Tampa Bay. The ships searched for Narvaez and his men for a full year, but never found them. So they assumed Narvaez and his men dead at this point. And as we were saying earlier, Narvaez and his men were up here at Appalachia Bay, which they called the Bay of Horses. They called Appalachia Bay the Bay of Horses because they survived there by eating their own horses. They also started melting their armor down to make nails for the purposes of building rafts to sail to Mexico. So by this point, they had completely given up on ever finding the ships, and they were determined to commit themselves to just survival at this point. So the rafts here on Appalachia Bay, they loaded them down with their provisions and supplies of fresh water. Cabeza de Vaca later recounted, and so greatly can necessity prevail that it made us risk going in this manner and placing ourselves in a sea so treacherous and without any one of us who went having any knowledge of the art of navigation. So here, once in the open sea, the raft started sailing west. They sailed west for a full month before their rations started running low. As bad as it was that they had lost their rations, that wasn't the worst part. Their biggest challenge was the lack of water. 5 days after their fresh water ran out, the men decided to drink seawater, which turned out being a very poor decision. The intake of the seawater drove many of the men insane, as that actually accelerates dehydration. And to make it worse, a storm started carrying them towards the Mississippi River. So here at the mouth of the Mississippi, they were still 600 miles away from northern Mexico. The river, with its very strong current, pushed them out into the open sea. The rafts became separated and exhausted. And we pick up here on the Texas coast, after passing the Mississippi River, the men were pushed towards the Texas coast. And they were still a long way away from northern Mexico where they were trying to get. But many of the rafts, in fact, some of the rafts made landfall down here in the Corpus Christi, Texas area. Some of the crews of that raft immediately got attacked by the Camon native tribe, and it took some of the men captive, but almost all of them, but very few, had been killed. So there were 2 other rafts up here in this area that included Narvaez, and those rafts made it to Matagorda Bay, which is what it's called, modern day Matagorda Bay. Narvaez attempted to assert his authority over those 2 rafts and ordered the men to camp on shore. And then while Narvaez and the rest of the men remained on the raft, a storm blew Narvaez's raft out to sea. While he was out to sea, all of the provisions were on shore, so Narvaez and his lieutenants died. And then there were 2 other rafts remaining that ended up on Galveston Island up here. And those rafts would contain what would be the only survivors of the expedition. So while they're up here on Galveston Island, the Capote tribes had observed the condition of the Spaniards. The Spaniards were in very poor condition, close to death due to starvation. They were cold from the ocean and near hypothermia. The natives, observing all this, began to understand their condition, because they had also seen some of the dead Spaniards who had actually drowned. Cabeza de Vaca recounted this encounter with the Capote by saying, "With great grief they felt pity on us after seeing us in such a state. They all began to weep loudly, and so sincerely that they could be heard a great distance away. To see these men lacking so in reason and so crude in the manner of brutes grieve so much for us. It increased in me and others the magnitude of our suffering." So you can kind of hear in that explanation 2 or 3 different things. First of all, that the Spaniards were in horrible condition. Second of all, Cabeza de Vaca and his men thought of the natives as being brute and being savage. So you can kind of detect a little bit of racism in there. But of course, we're talking about the 16th century, and Cabeza de Vaca, just like many of his time, were a product of their time. But the Spaniards were in such poor condition that they had really no choice but to trust the natives, and most of them did trust the natives. The natives carried the Spaniards away from the beach and built a fire, and some of the Spaniards refused to go. Cabeza de Vaca later said that they were fearing that the natives would sacrifice them. But as for the ones who went with the natives willingly, the natives gave them more food and continued to treat them kindly. Some of the men that had remained on the beach attempted another attempt to raft to Mexico, but they died in that attempt. The remaining men struggled to survive as winter took hold. So by spring of 1529, only 15 of the 80 marooned men remained alive on Galveston Island. but those 15 men were continuing to struggle. And the natives started having an expectation of them to pull their weight to assist their tribe. This was a problem for the Spaniards, however, because they were not skilled hunters. So the Capokes decided that they would enslave them and leave them to do sort of odd jobs such as carrying firewood and fetching water. The Spaniards, who initially had refused to stay with the natives and remained on the beach, cannibalized each other, which made the natives very appalled, ironically. The natives, for their part, began developing dysentery, likely from decomposing bodies of the Spaniards that had died. Almost half the natives that were on Galveston Island died. As a result, the natives did not trust the Spaniards and wanted to kill them. Cabeza de Vaca did manage to intervene and convince the natives to spare their lives. So the natives actually did agree to spare their lives if the Spaniards would agree to be their slaves. The survivors were poorly treated during their time with the Capokes. They were getting killed. As Cabeza de Vaca said, they would kill us for daring to go from one house to the other. So in summer of 1529, Cabeza de Vaca was taken by his new masters up here to the mainland, to Mahalo. Cabeza de Vaca took that opportunity to escape to an enemy tribe called the Charucos. And while he was with the Charucos, he successfully convinced them to let him act as a trader with the other tribes. So he was going to the Charucos, he was going to the Capokes, he was going to other tribes and acting as a trader. Surprisingly, they agreed to this. He helped them trade their pearls that they had gathered for hides with other tribes. Cabeza de Vaca did this for a total of 3 years. While he was doing this for 3 years, he took the opportunity to communicate with some of the other Spaniards that had survived. He worked very stealthily, trying to convince them to flee the area and head down here towards Mexico. So another tribe they fled to was the Miriamas tribe. They were located over here near San Antonio. And while they were there, Cabeza de Vaca and some of the other survivors became the first Europeans to ever encounter buffalo. Cabeza de Vaca later remarked that their meat was better than beef. But in spite of all this, their time with the Miriamas wasn't all that good. The Miriamas enslaved them and made them work hard. In September of 1534, the 4 survivors with the Miriamas over here on the Nueces River escaped from the Miriamas tribe, and they headed south. And as they're heading south, they encounter more hostile tribes. But the good news about this was they were able to use their previous knowledge that they encountered from the other natives, and they pretended to be medicine men. The men would demonstrate typical native medicine men behavior while they were encountering these natives, but they made one alteration. The men would say the Lord's Prayer and make the sign of the cross to pray for healing. This actually worked for the men, and the natives all around began bringing their sick to Cabeza de Vaca. And one of the other castaways later recounted, "In this way Jesus Christ guided us, and in his infinite mercy was with us, opening up roads where there were none." And the hearts of men so savage and untamed God moved to humility and obedience. So after being among all these different tribes as medicine men, the men continued traveling south and ended up at the Rio Grande River, which Cabeza de Vaca noted that the river was wider than the Guadalquivir and Seville. So at this point, after crossing the Rio Grande, they were very close to Mexico, or at least where the Spanish civilizations were at the time in Mexico, probably no more than 100 miles. But interestingly enough, Cabeza de Vaca and his men decided to turn west. They had heard from other native tribes that there were other tribes that needed their medicine men services. So they decided to head west along this trail here, which the trail is called the Corn Trail. It runs parallel to the Sierra Madre Mountains here in Mexico. It was actually a very heavily traveled native route. And after following this trail, the men were led to a village called Junta de los Rios. And by this time it was November of 1535. Junta de los Rios is located near modern-day Presidio, Mexico. So while they were here in Junta de los Rios, the men observed what could be called a very advanced native civilization. There were very sturdy homes in this area that overlooked cornfields. The men found this area very refreshing, but they decided they would keep following the Rio Grande River along the Corn Trail. So they continued following the river in a northwest fashion, and then eventually, after crossing the Rio Grande, they ran into some other natives. And by Christmas of 1535, the men spotted a Spanish buckle that was tied around the neck of a native. They talked to the native and inquired about the buckle. The native explained that it was traded by some men who wore beards. At this point, they knew that Spanish civilization had to be close. So they asked the native where the native had encountered the men and pointed them towards the Pacific. So they decided to head sort of in a southern route towards the Pacific Ocean. The survivors started following that path and kept following along between the Pacific and the Sierra Madre Mountains. And by April 1536, near the city of Culiacan, the four ragged castaways ended their journey, and it sounded something like this. There were 4 Spanish slave traders on horseback that saw natives walking barefoot and clad in skins. So in the distance, they spotted these supposed natives. The natives seemed somewhat ordinary, except rather than running away from slave traders as natives normally would do, they were heading straight towards the slave traders. So as the men approached, they noticed one man out of the group was white, and despite looking disheveled, he spoke perfect Spanish. Cabeza de Vaca later recounted, "They remained looking at me for a long time, so astonished that they could not speak." The men then told their story of the last 8 years. At last, the 4 survivors had found deliverance. Cabeza de Vaca used much of the rest of his life to try to persuade his crown to treat natives better. This pursuit of better native-Spanish relations had somewhat mixed results. There was a push, particularly by the religious church, to try to be missionaries towards these natives. The positive was it did contribute to a Spanish mission system that did provide for better native relations. I'd like to take this moment to talk about a little discussed event in early American history. As the New World was getting colonized, Spain had well-established colonies in the Caribbean. They had also established colonies in Mexico, as well as some other places. So they were looking at the possibility of searching for more gold, more riches, and potentially doing some colonization of their own in other places. Places like South America and as well as Mexico had been very profitable for the Spaniards. In fact, one of the men who was part of the Pizarro conquest, named Hernando De Soto, because he had profited so greatly from that Pizarro conquest of the Incas, they named him governor of Cuba. And eventually De Soto was charged with an expedition to Florida, or La Florida as they called it. This wasn't an expedition of colonization, but one that was searching for gold and profit. So coming up from Cuba in May of 1539, De Soto and his army of 500 landed in Tampa Bay, or what is now modern-day Tampa Bay. And it was a native village of Ozita that they went to first. Among the Ozita village, they found Juan Ortiz. Juan Ortiz had been marooned during a previous expedition called the Narvaez expedition, which is an altogether different story. Just a little preview for you on that. I will be discussing that in a later video. And it is a fantastic story and one of the greatest stories in American history. So there's your little preview. Juan Ortiz acted as a translator for De Soto throughout the expedition. Natives immediately started causing problems for De Soto's expedition. They were ambushing the Spaniards behind trees. And so they started heading north looking for gold. And they spent that entire summer fending off native attacks and trudging through swampland. And some of the swampland that they were going through are likely modern day areas where Orlando and Disney World is now located. So as they kept heading north, a lot of the natives had heard that they were coming. They abandoned many of those villages, and which gave De Soto an opportunity to raid their crops. And essentially that helped keep De Soto's men well fed during that time. So as they're heading through these deserted villages, finally they get to a village up here, up north, called Napatuca. There was a chief there among that tribe named Vitachuco. And it didn't take very long before the Spaniards were in a battle with the natives of Napatuca. They were, however, able to get the upper hand because the Spaniards had skilled horsemen. The natives were very inexperienced dealing with horses. So after killing Chief Vitachuco and then many other natives, the Spaniards allowed some of the remaining natives to keep their lives. But the Spaniards enslaved the natives and forced them to carry their provisions. So they were heading west from Napatuca towards Appalachia. De Soto had heard about Appalachia and decided that was a good place to make winter camp. So all these casualties and difficulties that were being endured by the Spaniards and the natives ensured that any future interactions that they had with the natives would not be smooth. All these tribes in these areas had heard about how heavy-handed De Soto was in dealing with the previous ones. So as they continued toward Appalachia, De Soto heard about a port over here in modern-day Pensacola area called Acusi. That port would be very easy for anyone sailing to bring provisions to be resupplied from Cuba. So De Soto then sent a captain named Maldonado back to Cuba and told him to meet in Acusi the following summer. So as De Soto and his men made winter camp in Appalachia, one of the natives dazzled the Spaniards with a story of a marvelous land near the rising sun, as they put it, which would have been northeast. So in that area, he had heard that there was a female ruler who had been paid tribute by many powerful chiefs, and there was an endless supply of gold. That's all it took for De Soto. He decided he was heading northeast towards the Promised Land once they were done with winter camp. So as De Soto and his men headed northeast, the Spaniards noted a change in both the native lifestyle and behavior. Rather than the grass-roofed huts that they had seen in Florida, they were now in what is now modern-day Georgia, and the roofs were thatched with cane. They had better dealings with natives in this area. The natives actually did supply De Soto and his men with turkey and maize, and they even agreed to guide them towards where the supposed Promised Land was. So they headed northeast, and then they crossed the Savannah River right here into what is now modern-day South Carolina. And they kept heading sort of a northeast track, and then they got to a village called Confidacheki. And there in Confidacheki, they found the female chief they had been promised. Female chief didn't come out with a bunch of gold or anything, however, but she did offer them grain in exchange for leaving half of her grain stock for her people. She figured, I think, that if she were able to buy the Spaniards off, they would leave her alone. She even gave De Soto what they had called a large strand of pearls. Those pearls were as thick as hazelnuts. So finally, De Soto did have some treasure that he could take back to his monarch, but they wanted more, obviously, and the natives only had copper and iron pyrite. So he thought, surely there must be some gold other places if there's no gold here. So he kept pressing the female chief for more information. She did point him towards a land on the Coosa River in Alabama that she had heard about. So De Soto decided to start heading that way. De Soto requested that the female chief provide him with a guide to get him there, but unfortunately she would not provide that for him, and her reasoning had to do with the poor behavior of the Spanish, and it can sort of be filled in the blank, sort of what that poor behavior was, likely theft and rape. So the female chief refused to send any guides with them. So then De Soto kidnapped her and then started heading the expedition north into the Blue Ridge Mountains. And as they headed up into the Blue Ridge Mountains, they started turning southwest, and they got to a little village. The name of the village was Chiaha, and I'm circling it now. In Chiaha, they found an agreeable chief who fortunately was able to give them food. But that wasn't enough for De Soto. De Soto demanded 30 female slaves for his officers. And then the chief refused that. And then that night, the native men smuggled the women out of town. The Spaniards then captured the men and then made them serve as porters to help them carry their provisions. So continuing the journey southwest, De Soto finally got to the Coosa River. They were near modern-day Rome, Georgia. And De Soto repeated the same pattern of capturing the local chief. But this time, De Soto actually released the chief as he headed out of territory. But then De Soto had kidnapped the chief's sister and would not release her. And apparently that was saddened the chief of Coosa, who reportedly was left in tears as De Soto and his men departed. So they headed down the southwest track, I should say, to a town called Tallahassee. So in this town, a powerful chief sent messengers to De Soto. And De Soto met this chief by the name of Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa sat on a platform on a mound in the village, which greatly impressed De Soto. But for his part, Tuscaloosa didn't seem impressed at all by the military might of the Spaniards. He refused to speak to anyone, would only speak to De Soto. And for his part, De Soto seemed actually very kind to Tuscaloosa at first, but then eventually Tuscaloosa put him under guard. The Spaniards asked Tuscaloosa for slaves, and he promised 100 women if he would proceed in a southwest track towards the town of Mobila. And that town, and I'm going to circle it here, is now modern day Selma, Alabama, or it's so believed. De Soto obliged, but kept Tuscaloosa under guard and sent some scouts ahead. The scouts had indicated to De Soto that it appeared that the natives of Mobila were headed to get ready for battle. But since the natives had been nice to De Soto and gifted him with bread made from chestnuts, De Soto disregarded all those warnings of the scouts and led his men into the town of Mobila without any concern of any impending threat. So on October 18th, De Soto and his men entered town. There was a whole lot of fanfare, a lot of dancing by the natives, and then Tuscaloosa excused himself to talk to the resident chief of Mobila. De Soto realized this was a problem, and he demanded that Tuscaloosa return back to him. But then Tuscaloosa replied with defiance, so one of the Spaniards cut off Tuscaloosa's arm with a sword. And that was it. Thousands of natives then poured out of their houses, shooting arrows at the Spaniards. The Spaniards then retreated to the outside of the town, attempting to reorganize. De Soto ordered his men to attack the fortress from 4 sides and began burning the town of Mobila. The natives resisted fiercely for 5 hours. One account of the battle said, "The struggle lasted so long that many Spaniards, weary and very thirsty, went to drink in a pond nearby that was tinged with native blood, and then returned to combat." So by the day's end, 2,500 natives had died. the Spaniards lost 22 men, but 200 of them also sustained injuries from arrows, and there were 80 horse casualties, which may not sound like a big deal, but given that that was the main military might of De Soto's men, that was a huge blow to De Soto. The battle also destroyed much of the Spaniards' food, and those pearls that De Soto had obtained from Confitechequi had burned in that fire. One account after the battle indicated that the Spaniards were dressing their wounds with the fat of dead natives. So now, as they're sitting here in this burned native village, De Soto had a decision to make. He had heard that his captain Maldonado was down here in modern-day Pensacola, so he had the option of preceding his men down here, and that would have been a really easy out that De Soto had. But there was a problem. Since the pearls had burned in the battle, De Soto essentially had nothing to bring back to his monarch. In addition to that, De Soto was dealing with undercurrents of mutiny within his own company, and he knew his reputation would be harmed if he returned back to Cuba with no treasure to speak of. So instead, De Soto doubled down and had his men head north. So as they headed north, in sort of a northwest track, they ended up in Chickaza, this native village here, which Chickaza is located in modern-day Tupelo, Mississippi. So De Soto decided to set up winter camp there. De Soto was feeling very vulnerable, so he decided to attempt to buy the natives off by gifting several of the Spaniards' pigs to the natives. Unfortunately, this gift backfired for the Spaniards because the natives loved the flavor of the pork so much that every night they started poaching additional pigs. The natives were eventually caught, and then De Soto returned the pig stealers to their people with severed hands. So in March of 1541, De Soto decided to leave winter camp and head northwest. He demanded 200 natives to carry provisions for the Spaniards from the local chiefs. At first, the local chiefs appeared to comply, but that night the natives attacked the Spaniards as they slept. The Spaniards were able to counterattack, causing the natives to retreat. So then the expedition continued northwest in a very battered and bewildered state. So they got to Quees, which is located near modern-day Memphis, Tennessee. Spaniards seized 300 women from a local tribe and sort of continued his pattern of wreaking havoc on the native locals. But then they decided to keep heading sort of a northwest track, and they sighted the Mississippi River. And it is believed that De Soto was one of the first to sight the Mississippi River of any European. However, as an aside, I want to mention that it's very likely that a previous expedition might have ended up down here near the mouth of the Mississippi, near New Orleans. So that belief that he was the first one to sight the Mississippi River may be incorrect. So as they're here at the Mississippi River, they had to figure out a way to forge that river. So they built rafts from trees, and they did manage to cross the Mississippi River. However, not before natives attacked De Soto and his men from canoes. They were able to avoid them, so they didn't inflict any huge casualties on them. So they made that successful crossing and headed northwest towards a town called Casqui on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River. And in this area, the Spaniards saw some very impressive fortified native towns. And De Soto did his best to try to pursue peace with those locals. And they were actually able to stay there and regain their strength. But the quest for gold continued, so they headed west across Arkansas. And then they wintered on the Arkansas River. So while they were wintering over here in western Arkansas, their interpreter, Juan Ortiz, had died, which made communication with the local natives impossible. So they're over here in this area of western Arkansas, which is not too far from Texarkana. And the natives there in the Tula area had attacked the Spaniards, leading the Spaniards to head sort of southeast towards the Mississippi River. So they ended up in this what would be termed the tri-state area of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And there in that area, Hernando De Soto caught a fever and died on May 21st, 1542. This was a problem for De Soto's men for obvious reasons, but also De Soto had previously tried to convince all the natives that he was an immortal or a deity. So his men did their best to try to conceal his death from the natives. They wrapped his body in a blanket and sunk it into the Mississippi River. So De Soto, having died, his men needed somebody else to lead them, so one of his lieutenants, Luis Muskoka, was left to continue the expedition. They decided they would take an overland route west towards modern-day Texas. So they're taking this overland route west in sort of a southwest track. They get down here to Texas, and there's very sparse native villages with not much for the De Soto's men to raid. So Muskoka decided, we've got to get out of Texas. It's too dry here. We can't raid any native villages. So they ended up going back towards the Mississippi River, back to around the same spot where De Soto had died. So then they had a decision to make. How are we going to get to Mexico City? And they decided the Mississippi River offered them the best chance. So they built rafts. They melted down all their iron and built rafts and used the iron as nails. But they had a little problem as they got into the spring. They wanted to leave, but a lot of floods kept them from being able to make that float trip. So by July, they set off finally down the Mississippi after the floodwaters had receded in their boats to try to get to the Gulf of Mexico. And as they're heading down the Mississippi, native tribes raided them the entire trip, and another dozen Spaniards died, and many more were wounded. So finally they made it out the mouth of the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico and down to Mexico City. Thus ends the expedition of Hernando De Soto.
I hope you've enjoyed this time and our discussion regarding the journey of Hernando De Soto and the Spaniards. So I wanted to go over different takeaways that we can glean from this story. The rough-handed nature of De Soto's interactions with the natives contributed to a lot more hostile relationships
down the line with other Europeans. Also, European diseases such as measles, smallpox, and chickenpox caused depopulation of several areas that the expedition went to. And perhaps one of the biggest blows was that the Mississippian native culture, which were all these organized chiefdoms, those actually devolved into less organized civilization. And so what we saw is a lot of depopulation of all these areas, not only from all the battles with the Spaniards, but also with diseases. Once those diseases were introduced into America. Another thing that happened due to this is that Spain reconsidered some of their colonization efforts after this. They did not want to really focus on areas that were northeast of Mexico due to all the difficulty that De Soto had. Pretty much ruined the area for Florida. They did concentrate their efforts though on Mexico, the Pacific coast, and Texas, and then they continued into the modern day state of Florida area with their settlements there, such as St. Augustine. But for the most part, their efforts were not quite the same after this. So I really appreciate your attention as we have gone over this story and this journey.
Of course, the conquest of Mexico was big for Spain. They established the colony of New Spain for Mexico here, and simultaneously there were several other expeditions and conquests happening in the Americas, including places like present-day Guatemala, Panama, and eventually South America as well. There were also attempts to explore the northern part of Mexico up here. They thought that there had to be other empires like the Aztecs that were just as rich and full of gold. There had long been this legend of Cibola, or the Seven Cities of Gold. I think some called it El Dorado. The legend had likely cross-pollinated from old Native American legends and old Spanish legends. They received some popularity after the ill-fated Narvaez expeditions. Survivors, which included Cabeza de Vaca, had heard all these tales from the natives that they interpreted to be Cibola, which was the old legend they had heard. And they reported these stories to the crown and to the governor of New Spain. So one of these survivors of the expedition was a former Moroccan slave by the name of Esteban. And years after the expedition, Esteban headed north again, where he had been before, with a friar by the name of Marcos de Neva. And Esteban and this friar had gone up here into the area that's now New Mexico and Arizona. And interestingly enough, Esteban met a very mysterious death on the journey, but Friar de Neva, who was with him, returned back safely, and Friar Marcos de Neva had claimed to have seen the city of Cibola from a cliff. And the death of Esteban and the stories that he told, looking through modern eyes, kind of makes Friar Marcos a very controversial figure. But at this point in the story, no one really had any reason to believe that Friar Marcos wasn't telling the truth. So enter Francisco Coronado, and Francisco Coronado is the governor of the New Spain province, which is roughly in this area here that I'm circling. It's called Nueva Garcia, and the capital is Compostela, which is where I'm kind of pointing right now. At this city, Coronado enlisted an army full of men and also natives. Many of the natives were fortune-seeking natives, and Friar Marcos de Neva accompanied him on this journey as well. And one of the directives that Coronado received from the Spanish crown was that Coronado must treat any villages that they encounter very kindly. He was told to reimburse any of the villages for any of the food and provisions that he took. So as they're ready, they're in the year 1539, they're ready to head north from Compostela. And once again, that's the very capital of the province that Coronado is the governor of. He's got about 300 horsemen and about 800 natives that were joining the contingent. And one historian later described the men that were part of the expedition by saying, many of them, tender sons of well-to-do families, were more accustomed to dallying in drawing rooms than to strenuous outdoor pursuits. The majority were new arrivals from Spain and wholly unacquainted with the American frontier. Few of them knew how to fasten their own packs. So you're dealing with a lot of men that are very wet behind the ears and very inexperienced with a long journey through a frontier. So in early 1540, the expedition departed and was heading north. The journey's difficulties were confounded by jungles of brush that extends along the plain north. And so many native laborers were used to kind of cut through these jungles to widen the path for the horses. Wildlife was also an issue, from mountain lions to coyotes. So as they're heading north, Coronado decides that he's going to send a contingent of men ahead to sort of scout this area where Cibola is. And then as they're here waiting, for the results of this scout team that's headed north, one of Coronado's lieutenants by the name of Lope de Samniego was shot by a native arrow, which killed him instantly. When Coronado learned of this, he had the natives who shot Samniego hung from the trees. So it's already sort of taken, the journey's already taken kind of a negative start here. And so while they're waiting for these scouts, the scouts sort of head up here north. They head up to a river called the Gila River. These scouts returned with news about the area, and they were hoping to hear stories of gold. But suffice to say, there was nothing really to report. There was no gold, no cities. So this was actually the first of many disappointments to come for Coronado. So at this point, they're still in the confines of New Spain, and then they make it over here to Culiacan on Easter Sunday, and they're able to resupply some provisions. So they continue heading north from Culiacan, and this is where the map switches. And you're going to see the rest of the expedition here. So after they've headed north from Culiacan, they end up heading to where the supposed Cibola is. They cross the Gila River, and they're heading along the Arizona-New Mexico border. And right here in Jauja, which is supposedly where Cibola is supposed to be, they get there, and what they found was far from a city of gold. It was a village, very small, but also a very crowded village. The village was not made of gold. It was mostly adobe, and these were the Zuni Pueblo natives. This was a very huge disappointment to Coronado, but also to his men, who became very mutinous. And obviously at this point, Friar Marcos de Neva is in a lot of trouble. All these men are cursing him for telling them about this supposed city of gold. and there's no gold to be found anywhere. So Marcos de Neva decides he better pack it in, and he heads south back to Mexico City in total disgrace. And then later he's referred to by other Mexicans as the liar friar for all the lies that he had told. Meanwhile, Coronado decides he wants to send some men west to scout the area, and so they start that process, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But as they're here in Jauja, Coronado sends a contingent of men to tell the Zuni people that they're now under Spanish rule and they're required to convert to Christianity. The Zuni would not become subject to Coronado quietly, though, and they begin attacking the Spanish, and then Coronado ended up wounded. But now the town does end up under Spanish control. They're able to start searching for gold. They don't find anything there but blankets and turquoise. So Coronado decides, okay, I'm going to use Jauja here as a base. And as I mentioned, he sent that party of men west towards the Grand Canyon. And then Coronado decides he's going to start heading east. And while the Coronado and the main army is headed east, the western faction comes up here to the Hopi tribe, and the Hopi help them sort of scout the area some, and they see the Grand Canyon. The Hopi tell Coronado's men that this river here, the Colorado River, is unnavigable. So they kind of take that, the Spaniards kind of take that at face value and decide they're not going to mess with trying to cross the Colorado River. But they do see the Grand Canyon and the rim. I believe this would be the eastern rim of the Grand Canyon. And then they see it, but they send somebody ahead to Coronado to let him know what they saw, and they report nothing but a vast wasteland. So the Hopi native tribe, since they sort of convinced the Spaniards that this river was unnavigable, they were really probably telling them that so they would move along. So meanwhile, Coronado's heading east, as I mentioned. They encounter a Pawnee native by the name of, well, they call him the Turk because they thought he looked Turkish. But this Turk had told Coronado that east of there's a land called Quivira, which is located in the present-day Kansas area. Supposedly it's full of gold, silver, and fine fabrics, and even canoes that were made with gold bells. Coronado decides to make the winter camp here at Tygo, which is near modern-day Santa Fe, New Mexico. The expedition arrived in Tygo needing food and water, and in some cases the Spanish did barter for it, but eventually they just began taking what they needed. And that led to some problems with the natives in Tygo. And one Spanish soldier assaulted a Pueblo woman there in Tygo, and it started what is referred to as the Tygo War, which lasted for about 3 months. While the natives had some defensive advantages in Tygo, by the following March of 1541, the Spanish defeated the Tygo. Hundreds of the tribe had been killed, and only a small number of Spanish died. After all this carnage in Tygo, Coronado started heading east and resuming his search for Quivira. And this is kind of the path he followed. He went along these different rivers through here, through the top of Texas, and then up through the panhandle of Oklahoma. And then as they're heading up here towards Quivira, they get up here, and this is actually near Salina, Kansas, is where Quivira is located. They didn't find anything there, no more than teepees. So of course this puts the Turk at severe odds with Coronado. The Turk had to admit that he lied to Coronado, and Coronado had him executed. But ironically, while here in Quivira, Coronado is only like a couple 100 miles from another expedition, which is the De Soto expedition. So we've kind of come sort of full circle here from my very first video on De Soto to my very last video that I've created anyway for Coronado. So it's just a little interesting footnote there. So for the aftermath of this expedition, Coronado decides to return back to Mexico, has basically nothing to show for his journey, lost a lot of money that he invested into the expedition, but also eventually there became reports of the different war crimes that Coronado leveled against the natives. He was tried for those war crimes and he was found not guilty, but as a consequence, he did lose his position as governor, and then 12 years later, Coronado died. So of course, like all the other expeditions and other colonizations that came before were to come, even though, you know, there were a lot of natives killed in war during this expedition, the biggest damage that were done to the native populations was the spread of diseases. And then, of course, looking back through modern eyes, the discovery of the Grand Canyon was a pretty big deal, but to the Spaniards, it barely made any waves at all. Coronado viewed the canyon as a wasteland, and he was told the Colorado River was unnavigable. So the irony of all that is today the Grand Canyon is one of the most visited natural wonders in the world, and the Colorado River supplies water to millions of people. New Spain as a colony would continue to thrive, but eventually they would colonize north several decades later into some of the same areas that Coronado went through. The end of the era of the Conquistador, however, made way for more peaceful incursions of Spanish and eventually Mexicans into areas north of the Rio Grande before the era of the United States took hold. So we've kind of come full circle here with our conquistadors, and I thank you for your attention.